What tools do we have to shape culture? How are they best used, and do they even work?
This podcast is brought to you by Archimed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Archimed.
And I'm Caroline Squatrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us.
All right, Caroline, what's the question of the day?
Today, we are going to talk about some tools we can use to help shape and improve company culture. We will first be joined by our own fearless leader, John DeSalvo, CEO of Archimed. And then we will have two guests. We'll have Marcy Bandick. She is a leadership development consultant at the Strategy Forums. And we'll also have Mike Elliot with us, who is a leadership and organizational development specialist at ADVISA.
And for full disclosure, Archimed and or Herring Capital both use the Strategy Forums and ADVISA to help us out along the way. But first, hey, John, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
It's great to be here.
So, John, my business partner and the CEO of Archimed, he brought the Predictive Index tool to Archimed, and I think he's the right guy to tell us, pre-PI and post-PI, what it was like to recruit, what was it like to communicate, hire, et cetera. So, John, love to hear your perspective on how these tools have made a difference.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the hardest things when you're in any sort of organization that is either growing, downsizing, or just trying to maintain and replace talent from time to time is making sure that you're hiring for fit. And we learned very early on the pain of hiring for need and not for fit. And we never had tools to figure out whether someone would be a fit or not, other than a possible referral or certain things we were looking for on a resume. And then I got to learn about the Predictive Index and how the Predictive Index can tell you a person's DNA of how they think and how they go about approaching problems and how they communicate and what motivates them or areas where they may need to be coached. And as I went through the process of trying to figure out whether PI or Predictive Index would be something great for Archimed, I remember making referral calls. And I spoke to a gentleman that ran a 300-person facility down in Virginia. And they make cabinets. And I got on the phone with him, and we had a great, 20-minute conversation. And I said, well, what's the one thing about PI that I should really know, and why does it work so well? And his comment to me was, it's not always right, but it's never wrong.
Yeah, I gave you credit for that quote, but I guess it goes to the guy in Virginia. But I totally agree. I remember showing my PI to my wife, Megan, and I said, this sentence here, come on, that's so off base. And she read it and she goes, okay, whatever you say. It was on point, but it's not always that we can see all those things in ourselves, but they do exist. I wanted to go back to the pre-PI hiring for fit and not for need, and the faith we have in this statement allows us to use PI to hire for fit. That as painful as it is to have an open position, hiring for need and not for fit, rather than waiting an extra 6 months to hire the right person, it's take your lumps now and get it right down the line. And I think that that's something that we really needed to learn the hard way. And then finding the tools help us execute that strategy. Would you agree with that?
100%. Success in hiring does not come from desire to be successful. It comes from using tools and how to truly figure out whether or not someone fills the need in the organization and can fit that need culturally and from a perspective, and possibly bringing something to the team that we don't currently have. And that's the other power of PI, is when you're able to say our team makeup is all the same or very similar. When you're making a hire and you're using a tool like that, you could say, we need someone that brings a different approach, a different perspective, because that's truly what the team lacks. And that to me is a unique way of looking at fit.
So, John, I'd be curious if you had a story you would want to share with us, either hiring for need and how it didn't turn out well, or using PI to put somebody in a new position. You know, they were hired into one position, but you used PI to say, hey, you'd be a really good fit over here, something you never thought about, but a completely new division. Any stories you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to touch on both. The first one is when we were hiring for a C-level executive here at Archimed, and before I really understood PI or the effects of PI, we were very new into it. And we had hired someone into the C-level suite that was very controlling and was not an effective delegator. And it turned out to be a disaster for the organization. This person signed up to do a lot of things, it put more on their plate than they could ever achieve. And then once they filled their plate and couldn't deliver to things they promised on, they lost the team. And the team no longer trusted that person. And then they started workaround plans. And when you start to work around people in leadership positions, or you start to work around really anyone within an organization, it can become toxic very quickly. And then everyone begins to wonder, why is it that this person is supposed to be here to help me, but they're acting as a roadblock? And this went on for the better part of a year before we made a decision that this is not a fit. And we learned a lot from that, and specifically I did, in the organization also, to where now we are more aware of that tool and knowing when that person comes in, what some of the challenges may be and where they might best fit in what their first 3 to 6 months would look like from a learning perspective, from a communication perspective. And that was hard. It was a long year. And I would say that anyone listening to this podcast that's in a business can relate to what that feels like in an organization when that happens. The second one that I would use is, I guess I'd use our co-host of this podcast, in Caroline. Caroline has when I looked at her PI and what our needs were from a development standpoint and people recruitment standpoint, her PI matched someone that would be skilled at that. She didn't have the work experience. She didn't have necessarily the educational background of how to do that, but she was a perfect fit for what that job was going to require. And 2 years ago, I couldn't even imagine her doing a podcast nor recruiting for Archimed, but I think that she's taken to it. She's done a phenomenal job. And if it wasn't for PI, I probably would have never even thought of it.
Yeah, Caroline, just for our listeners' sake, has a background and a degree in marketing and came on as a marketing intern and excelled at that. And now she's in charge of people development. Or you're our people. What's your title?
So this is a good example of, titles are kind of meaningless sometimes because I have this weird title. So it's right now it's talent engagement specialist, but yeah, I mean, I I think the easiest way to put it, as I learned from a peer in HR who I look up to a lot, is, I'm in charge of the employee life cycle here. So I still do some marketing. However, I will say we now have interns that do the bulk of it. So any cool marketing you see out there is not really me anymore. So no credit to me there. But yeah, I mean, I've loved taking on just, it's all about our culture. It's about how we meet people, how we bring people on, and how we develop people. And I have so much to learn, but I've enjoyed diving into it. And without John bringing any of this to my attention, it would not have crossed my mind. So I appreciate you for that and for seeing the potential there, because, it wouldn't have occurred to me to do this unless you brought it up to me. And then it was like I was like a dog with a bone, where I was like, no, this is happening. We're going to make this happen. So it's
I
been a
won't
fun
call you
journey.
a dog with a bone. I'll call you a specialist.
A specialist.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, but I love dogs. So
So those are both great stories, and there are more stories of each kind here at Archimed. Hopefully, in the future, we'll have many more stories of using PI to help people reach their potential and continue their professional development, and fewer stories about people who were hired for need and not fit. So, John, thanks a lot for sharing your perspective about using these tools, and also, of course, for being my business partner, and for being such a wonderful leader of Archimed, and for caring so much about the company and all the employees. So thank you for that. And then now we're going to get some expert advice from Mike Elliot and Marcy Bandick. Well, today we have two guests joining us, which is wonderful and special. Marcy Bandick is a leadership development consultant at the Strategy Forums, and Mike Elliot is a leadership and organizational development specialist at ADVISA. And both the Strategy Forums and ADVISA help Heron Capital and Archimed along our journeys. So thank you both for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, good to be here. Nice. Good. Can't wait to talk more.
Yes, great. So what we want to talk about today are all the various tools, the tools that we use to improve the way we communicate, improve interpersonal relationships and communications along those lines, and then eventually, hopefully, to use these tools to positively impact company culture. So maybe we can start with Marcy and then with Mike. What tools are in your repertoire?
Well, I think the first few that I would mention tie so directly to how people work together, and that's the DISC profile that we use, which looks at really your hard coding, your hard wiring, and your personality style. We love it because it's actionable, and it's something that allows you to very simply take a good look at yourself and also to better understand others. The second one that we rely heavily on is EQ, which provides some incredible insights to how people deal with change, with stress, with just demands of the day. And we all know that we're dealing with a lot of demands of the day, and how we adapt to that and how connected we are to understanding ourselves and others really enables people to work better with each other and with their teams. We do work of leaders, which is also a DISC assessment, which looks at competencies of leadership and where your DISC style, your personality style, and where your leadership tendencies fall and how you can improve those. We also do work with productive conflict, because of course that conflict is good. Conflict can be incredibly productive. So we do work around productive conflict, 5 behaviors of cohesive teams to make sure that there's trust and all the other key elements of an effective team. So there's an arsenal of pieces. I'd say the first couple of DISC and EQ are probably the most fundamental that we use with many employees at all different levels.
Mike, what about you?
Yeah, pretty similar to Marcy as far as the types of tools. So we do a little bit of a different tool there called Predictive Index, which again, as Marcy said, has that hard drive. So the way that you are hardwired, as opposed to, as Marcy talked about, the emotional intelligence tool, we use a similar one there too. It talks more about the soft wiring, so the way that we show up into the world. But those are probably the main two assessment tools that we use at ADVISA. And like Marcy said really well, it just helps people to know, who they are, but then also how are they showing up into the world, which is where, to Marcy's last point there about conflict, is usually where it happens, right? Like where we start to here's how I speak, here's how you speak, but we're speaking different languages. So when you can put some really good actionable tools in front of people, usually we have better conversations, which lead to better outcomes.
So it seems like the PI tool and the DISC tool are very similar in what they're trying to accomplish. But perhaps there were also differences. I know that one difference is the pricing structure, and that can impact when there's a lot of other aspects that are equal, which one you choose. PI is a per company price, and DISC is a per person price. So that might impact how people decide between the tools. But is there another reason why you would want to choose DISC over PI or vice versa?
So, it's interesting. We were just talking about this a little bit ago. I've not used predictive index. I'm accustomed to it. I've seen it. So I would probably defer to Mike to talk about predictive index. The one thing I'll tell you that we spend a fair bit of time with DISC is really understanding the core foundation of how your style is derived. So DISC is based off of a model that looks at two dimensions. One that looks at, if you will, how bold and assertive and driven somebody is versus reflective and methodical. It also looks at another dimension that looks at, are you more task and work and challenge oriented? Are you more relationship and being accessible oriented? And when you look at that, you can start to see where the different styles come from. And that's great for understanding yourself. But the power of this is also to look at that as you're working with others to figure out, all right, I'm working with somebody who's clearly more relationship and more accessible, and they really are very methodical in how they approach the world. Now I can start to read this person, even without knowing what their DISC style is from having done an assessment, but I can start to get a gauge of folks and maybe, not maybe, but definitely adapt my style and flex my style to better work with that person. So what I like about DISC is it teaches you a fair bit of just how to look at the world around you and how to then flex yourself to become more effective in working with the others. And like Mike said, to have those conversations that are more productive. So I can speak to that from a DISC standpoint. I'd ask Mike to speak to that more from a predictive index.
So, Mike, I want to get your take on predictive index. I know you're familiar with DISC, as most people are. Maybe you could help explain why you would choose predictive index over DISC, and also specifically whether you think predictive index has a unique ability in the hiring process.
Yeah, so I'll start with the hiring process part. Is the thing I've liked about the predictive index tool is that it really allows a HR manager, a executive team, whoever, to really think thoughtfully about what do we need in this role, as opposed to just thinking about subjectively whoever shows up. I need to decipher. Well, I've got this and I've got that, but you can really think, hey, we need this. So when they start to interview, they can ask better questions to find out, who's in front of me, and also you have their data in front of them too. So they can try to sell you sometimes in the interviews. I found that. But this really helps you to really find out at the end of the day, when you show up, when things get tough, when you're in your best seat, you're going to act in this sort of way. So it really gives you some incredible data to hire people and not be surprised. I know a lot of people sometimes after the onboarding process, like, oh, who's this person? That's not the person we had in the interview. So predictive index, I've really enjoyed that part because it gets down to the hard wiring as opposed to maybe who you were for 20, 30 minutes in an interview. So that's been helpful. So as far as the differences between the two, again, I'm not as knowledgeable with DISC, but what I'll say about predictive index that we've also enjoyed is that it gives people an understanding of, here are the strengths. The way we say it is, here's the good news, here's the bad news to your personality. And the thing that I've liked about that is it gives someone an ability to know, hey, here's where I'm going to come and be my strongest, but also here's going to be some things, going to be some watch outs for me. So I think that's been a really great part that the predictive index has really illuminates for people their strengths and potential weaknesses. And then what we say is that you become self-aware. So then you have to self-manage those aspects. So I think the predictive index tool does a really good job of helping you to self-manage who you are, because, hey, don't we all need help self-managing who we are along the way? So I'd say that's the difference that I've really enjoyed about it. But again, both tools are trying to help you illuminate who you are. But especially in the workplace, I found that pretty helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, we've used predictive index since I've been at ArcMed, and they PI'd me right away when I came in, and
PIG.
yeah. And I thought it was surprisingly accurate. I know a lot of people I talk to feel the same, but how much weight should we be putting behind tools like this? I mean, like I said, I think mine's very accurate. I think a lot of ours come back pretty accurate. Is there a risk of kind of like pigeonholing someone into a PI type, a disc type, that we could be overlooking something?
Yeah, I think so too. Marcy, do you want to have a crack at that first, or?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, DISC is, it's one of those, I love what you just said. When I got here, they PI'd me because I think, I think we have to be cautious when we use, at least with DISC. I love using DISC when I've got maybe a final group of candidates. Um, and it's less about the decision around who I choose, because clearly jobs have personalities and people have personalities. And when you can have somebody with a personality that we think is going to fit, that's great. But it also, you want to blend within your team. So it's going in with eyes wide open that says, hey, this person is going to be naturally gravitating to, let's say, being more assertive and being, out there, maybe more challenging, maybe a little bit more bold in their approaches. And this team doesn't have a lot of that. Well, okay, let's look at the job. Is the job going to benefit from that? Or is the team, frankly, going to benefit from that? Because the team may need it, even though the job, if this person has been a research scientist before, and what we're hiring for is a research scientist, and they've been successful in that, I'm okay that they maybe have a profile that looks quite a bit different because my team needs that. So I absolutely think it's a part of the process. I love doing it as soon as that person's feet are on the ground in the company. I do caution people how they use at least DISC before they make the hiring decision. If they have a finalist group of a few, that's one thing. But to use it in a mass way, it concerns me that it won't be one of the factors. It'll become the only factor, because oftentimes multiple styles will be very effective in a particular position. And it gets to so many other factors like skills and competencies and experiences.
Hmm. Yeah, I think Caroline, like Marcy said about the eyes wide open, I think it's a really good way to put that, because I think the danger is when you become fundamentalist about it. It's like, well, this will only work. Now, it's data, so it's going to be helpful, but it's a data point is the key thing to use. Is like, hey, this is helpful for a part of the conversation, but to just sit and like just go through a whole bunch of resumes and just parcel out and filter out people just based on their profile, I think could be folly, unless you've seen this time and time again, maybe in a more manufacturing, repeatable process. But I would definitely advise against just using it as like a big knife. Like, oh, nope, you're not going to make it. So I think it's important that it's a data point, and realize that's data to help you have better conversations, either in the hiring process and then on the onboarding process too. So you're better equipped.
Yeah, that's helpful. I've heard it described, PI and DISC as it may not always be right, but it's never wrong. And and I remember when I took home my PI to my wife, and I said, I think this is off. Read this sentence and read that sentence. That doesn't describe me at all. And she read it and she goes, yeah, that's you. And so sometimes it's a good look in the mirror to help us, as you say, illuminate our personalities, and then maybe take a little bit of control over it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Greg, about the take control over it, because I think so much of us, again, using Marcy's phrase of eyes wide open, I think we have eyes wide open to what we think we are. And again, that's a valid point, but a lot of times we don't have that really strong mirror of like, here's really who you are and the wake that you are giving off into the world. And sometimes we need a spouse or a coworker or a manager to really say, hey, this is kind of who you are. And they're like, okay. So I think those moments of, mirror moments are really important. And, DISC and PI will definitely give that to you.
Well, and what I would add to that too, regardless with either tool, is it does give you some language and vocabulary to have conversations that could be challenging otherwise. So it's a lot easier to talk to somebody when everybody's gone through DISC or everybody's gone through PI, and you're developing them, especially that onboarding. So thank you for mentioning onboarding, Mike. But as you're onboarding somebody, to be able to say, look, here's how you are likely going to come across, right? You are going to be very methodical. You're going to be very involved with the level of accuracy, let's say. Um, and let me tell you right now, you're going to have to build some strong relationships with this person and this person. And what I know about them is that they tend to be very different. This person is a D, or this person is an S. They're a steady, or they're an influence, whatever they are within DISC. Let's talk about strategies for making you more effective with them. And boy, that is powerful. So that language and that opportunity to have a hook into that kind of an onboarding discussion is tough to come by otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a guess.
Yeah, Marcy, you touched on using DISC and PI and building successful teams and looking at it that way as we're hiring. How do we use these tools to find the best blend of people for a given team? I feel like my default would be we want to have this balanced team of, all of these drives are covered, but is there ever an instance where you want a team to be overwhelmingly one drive over the other, or how do you go about building these teams?
I mean, it's a great question, and which is why I do like using DISC after the fact. So that as soon as somebody gets into the role, I think there are very few places where I would say, from a style standpoint, you don't want some element of blend. It may be, even what I love is I've seen a lot of leadership teams, quite honestly, or even in a manufacturing setting, you're clearly going to see some dominant style. So if you're in manufacturing, you could likely see a lot of conscientious style, because there's a methodical, there's an accuracy. But you know what? You also need somebody in there, maybe a couple of people who care about creating some glue and bond for the team. So having somebody who's maybe more of a steadiness style, or maybe more of that dominant style even, could bring some value in it, as long as they know how to work together. So I'm hard pressed to think of a team, certainly not at a leadership level, but even in a manufacturing setting, where there is a significantly greater benefit of having everybody, if you will, with that same style. Um, like I said, even in a more manufacturing routine type of work, I want somebody in there who's going to speak out. I want somebody in there who's going to be very careful and accurate and drive the team towards that. And I want somebody to make sure that, we're thinking about ourselves as a team. So, like I said, it doesn't have to be an even split across by any means, but just knowing you've got voices in there that are going to represent a different view, and that they know how to pull each other's voices out, because they've had this language and they understand, they've been onboarded appropriately, and they know not to walk over somebody who's going to be more quiet. I think there's power in that.
I wanted to jump to EQ, and specifically, I'm thinking about what I've learned over the last few years about the impact of one's emotional intelligence on success in the workplace. I spent most of my career thinking about IQ and skill competency, and learned a little too late than ideal that how important it is to have a emotional intelligence. Plato said all learning has an emotional base, and that's abundantly clear the longer I spend in the workplace. And I read from the Center for Creative Leadership that some 3/4 of careers are derailed, not for skill issues or IQ issues, but emotional competencies and failures in that arena. So how should we think about using EQ measuring tools in the workplace?
Mike, you want to give that a cut first?
Yeah, I really agree with you, Greg, on just sometimes the lack of understanding of how our emotions show up in the workplace. A lot of times, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it's like, hey, the emotions, even to today, really, that emotions don't really have a place in the workplace, but you can't just keep them at home. They come with you everywhere you go. And I think the more we can better understand how we're showing up into the world, and I think that's what the EQI 2.0 assessment really does, is it shows here's how you're showing up into the world. Here's the skills you're using, and here's the ones you're not using. And I've seen more leaders be derailed by emotional-esque issues, their skills, than anything hardwired, for sure, 100%. Those are the things that are going to take you out. And I could share story after story of leaders who are super talented but aren't aware of their emotional wake or the way they're showing up. And so just as in agreement there, Greg. I think that's important that we see that. And these assessment tools allow us to really help people fine tune. Here's where you're showing up. We're using these skills in a really good way. Here's how you can develop them. And here's ones that are totally underutilized and potentially are having an effect in the way that you're leading. And like that word I've used, the wake that you are leaving behind you, that it's almost impossible to follow you because of your emotional state.
Well, before we jump to Marcy's take on it, Mike, can you share one of those stories?
Yeah, there was a leader I worked with who was probably one of the most talented leaders as far as developing new ideas, new vision. As far as like he would go into a room and could sell an idea like no one else. But the organization had incredible turnover. Year after year, just incredible turnover. People would try and go, okay, I'm going to try to work with this leader and I'm going to see if I can do some changes. But eventually we're burnt out because there was just always new vision, new ideas. But from an emotional state, as far as understanding, his ability to build strong relationships, his ability to, deal with stress was very low. So therefore, it really caused so much conflict in the organization that all we had was like, yeah, we got good ideas. But as far as trying to just stick it out relationally, or the stress that was caused because of the new ideas was very challenging. And that was just rife throughout the whole organization, which eventually saw someone's life work be taken out because there's like, hey, like you got good ideas, but no one wants to work with you. And eventually that was not going to work any longer. So that's a huge loss for someone so talented.
That's a really brutal to not be able to give all of your talents because of EQ issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's something you can really work on. It doesn't have to be static. It's not how you're wired in that sense.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Marcy, what's your take on EQ?
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to just tag on real fast what you just said. EQ changes over time. It is absolutely dynamic. We sort of joke it almost has a half-life or a shelf life of maybe 6 months, because depending on what your snapshot in time and what your snapshot in your mind is at a certain point of even taking it, the effort you put in to actually develop those skills that Mike was talking about, you will see changes over time. So that's what I love about EQ is it's not your set in stone ways. This is a snapshot into who you are and how you need to shift that. Let me just take a quick step back. I want to tie it to culture. So a lot of organizations say, we're either driving for a culture change or, we're trying to better define our culture. And they focus on that word culture. Culture, in my view, is an outcome of a number of levers that you pull. Your leadership is a lever. It is one of those factors that create a culture. The people you have and how they work together is another lever. The operations and practices of how you get work done. Are you collaborative? Do you have flat types of processes, or do you have to get lots of approvals? You're very hierarchical. Your structure says a lot about your culture, and how you govern yourselves is another lever. And as you pull each of those levers, which is why when you see a new leader show up, it changes the culture, because they have different expectations and they may approach what they choose to model very differently. So culture itself is an outcome of all those different pieces. So EQ and the impact EQ has not just on leaders, but certainly to a great extent on the leadership expectations. The modeling that you see is so substantial. So a leader who understands and can relate and has a more balanced profile, when we look at EQ, that can show empathy, but can be assertive, who has a grip on, how they manage their impulses, and also can, express themselves emotionally, and they truly have a view of themselves and how they land on others and how they read other people. That type of leadership creates a different type of culture, a healthy culture, more so than a leader like what Mike just described, it is all about the work, the numbers, the challenge, and doesn't see what the impact is on the organization. So that leadership lever is so incredibly important in creating that culture. And EQ is one of the sort of the holy grail, if you will, to really trying to get leadership to behave in a way that optimizes everybody. And it's not just the leader, it's always the team. It's always a leadership team.
Yeah, I'm an example of that evolution of EQ. I took an EQ test a couple years ago, and it confirmed what I knew to be correct. I had a lot of areas of improvement, possible areas of improvement in across the EQ spectrum, and then I had a lot of tools given to me by this EQ test and the results, and I got to work and just recently took the EQ test again, and I improved in those areas. But one of the greatest pieces of feedback wasn't the quantitative results of that second EQ test, but in discussing the fact that I was taking that test with my executive assistant, she said, for what it's worth, you're a lot easier to work with now than you were a few years ago. And I thought, well, that's pretty much what I was going after. So that made me feel pretty good.
That's awesome.
I think that's exactly it, is that these tools that we've talked about today are ultimately it's judged, and it's the scoreboard is, are you easier to work with? Are we getting more done because of this data? And that's always probably the highest compliment you can get, Greg, is, yeah, you're easier to work with, and we're getting things done that we set out to do, because that's where most of the conflict in organizations is the working with each other is so challenging. So that's great to hear, Greg.
Thanks.
I can attest to that as well, Greg.
Thank you, Caroline.
To be fair, when I came in, I was an intern and very scared of everything, including you. And part of it, I think, is us working together more. But I do think you've made some good improvements.
Great, another reference point.
I also think that I need to make a lot of improvements as well. So I don't mean to pick on you. But yeah, so I'm glad we started talking about culture, because as you guys know, this is the reason why we're here. Greg and I want to learn not only about culture, but about actionable ways that we can positively impact and influence our company's culture. One example of something we've started doing is actually, making everybody's PI public, so that we can kind of encourage people to learn about it, read about it, and know how to interact with their fellow coworkers. I'm curious to know, one, if that's even a good idea, if that's helpful what we're doing, but then also just EQ, DISC, PI, any other tools. How do we actionably use them to improve our culture for the better?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, just quickly on the placards being shown around, I think the more that you can show people who you are, and this is the language that I speak, the easier it's going to be when someone comes up to you and says, oh, Caroline needs X, Y, and Z, or Greg needs X, Y, and Z. We can have better conversations. Just like if someone speaks Spanish or speaks Mandarin, if I know that, I can then speak your language, and therefore we're going to have a better conversation. When we don't acknowledge that, it's like two different languages happening, and therefore the dance and the stepping on toes happen. So I 100% think make that as public and socialized as possible.
I totally agree with that. But what you just said is different than a list somewhere. And this may be my style. So I love having the placard. And I know, well, back in the day, we were all actually at a desk. It was easier. We may not all be at a desk anymore, but having that visible reminder, both for the person themselves, but for somebody as they come in and talk to them, that they're talking to a D, that I'm a dominant. So they probably want to be a little bit brief and to the point when they come talk to me. I love that reminder. But what I like about putting it in a placard is it's at that point of interaction. And it sort of says, hey, I'm being transparent about myself. And it also gives me a little bit of permission to say, hey, listen, I would appreciate it if we could make a decision on this now, because there's just more openness. There's something I must say, I would be a little skeptical of the approach of having a list somewhere that everyone could just sort of access. I totally love the intent of that. We want to be open about it, but it's almost like it takes it away from the conversation. So I will make assumptions about somebody because they are, let's say, a C, or again, whatever the style is, and I may then make other assumptions about that person. There's something about learning that about that person when I'm having a conversation with them that allows an exchange, and it makes it a lot more richer than just knowing that this person is a letter. So it's a subtle difference, but I love the idea of making it public. I would probably do it, like Mike said, at that point of interaction.
Yeah, Mike also taught me about the platinum rule. So instead of the golden rule, that's the platinum rule, and you communicate with others the way they want to be communicated with. And I was chatting with Marcy about the need to understand how to interact with other people, and we jokingly discussed the idea of putting together a manual. This is the instruction manual on how to communicate and interact with Greg. And but the more I think about it, the more I like the idea. Just a set of bullet points of how I like to be communicated with. Do you think that's worthwhile?
Yeah, again, it depends on the application. Like I think going back to Marcy's point, you still want things to be organic, and we can't control everything. But I do like the thought maybe it's the work for you, and it's all about the context in which you do it. So maybe you do it with your closest team members. But again, if you, like Greg said, I didn't know you, and I show up for a conversation, you just guys slid across the table your manual, especially as with my profile, I'd be like, oh boy, here we go. It may not get us the best start, but I do think it's good data. But I think it's all about the context, and maybe it's more about good work for you or for other people to do. So they've done some thoughtful prep work, but it could potentially create some pretty robotic conversation long term. But I do think it has its place there. And I think people need to do that. It's what we call self-awareness work. So if you've done that self-awareness work and you want to share that with people, I think that's really helpful, especially as you're developing as a team.
Yeah. So worthwhile to do, even if for my own use.
Yeah. It could just be like a journaling sort of thing for
and
you.
then maybe share it with just the people who I interact with a whole lot, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And your personality, Greg, that would make a lot of sense to do that. I would not get.
Can I have a copy of that?
You bet.
I'll make one for you.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Caroline, let's do that. That'd be fun.
So Caroline, you asked though how to operationalize a lot of this, and the one thing I would say is, and something I think Greg you said earlier triggered this from me. It takes a lot of discipline to go through any of these tools, any of these assessments, and then do something with them. No surprise, Greg has a level of, discipline in how he's managed his own EQ, and he's seen the benefit of that. It is tough to come through one of these tools and really have that self-discipline. I personally recommend, I love when teams go through things together, whether it's EQ, whether it's DISC or Predictive Index, whatever the case may be, because again, you've got that vocabulary, but talk about it in one-on-ones. So, I assume you're building development plans with folks. And when you have a discussion or you're just coaching somebody, DISC or their EQ or whatever the case may be, should be a part of those discussions. I always love leadership teams that will make it maybe on a monthly basis, part of their staff meeting. So, if they've gone through an experience together, whether it's Predictive Index or EQ or DISC, whatever, let's talk about some things that we've tried to do differently, either as a team or even one-on-one. So you've got to keep it visible, if for no other reason, so that folks can actually get the help that they need. They're getting the coaching that they need. Hey, I'm trying to strengthen, my ability to really express kind of where I'm coming from. Because I recognize I look aloof if I don't. I've learned that through, EQ. Hey, boss, or frankly, hey, peer, or hey, person who reports to me. How am I doing? And have I missed opportunities to, and when you start to talk more about it, it becomes a much more transparent organization, but you just learn a lot from the people around you. So the more you can keep it top of mind, which is why I like the idea of keeping those placards more visible, is that to me is the ticket to success.
Yeah, I think the practice is really important, and knowing that this is a relationship, we're going to make mistakes along the way. I'm going to say things to Greg that he's not going to like the way he wants it, and vice versa. I think it's really good to make sure that this is known, that it's not about getting perfect, about progression along the way. That's also my personality coming out. So high D probably would not be as doesn't want to make mistakes, but I think the more you can see it as practice, it's going to take time. With Predictive Index, I recommend allowing as many people as possible into the software as you can. You can obviously use different administration rules, but let people get into it. So then it's a tool that's available to them. So if they're having maybe some issues or have some opportunity, with different team members. They can go in there and use the data, run different reports, like the relationship report. Relationship guide is one of my favorites to do. Is you put two people's names in there, and then the algorithm prints out some talking points for you to think about. Here's where you're going to work well together. Here's going to be some cautions, and here's some things to work on. And that could be, like to Marcy's point about the one-on-ones, that can be a really nice kindling for a good conversation to go, hey, it says this. What do you think about that? What do you think about that? And like a good marriage or partnership, that's what happens. You go, oh, I didn't realize you like that. It can be a really good discovery and exploration that creates better dynamics.
I think that's a great reminder. Anytime you can look at team level reports, and I actually just had a client group with a leadership team of about 7 or 8. And they went through EQ individually, learned a lot individually, and then wanted to go through it as a team. So we pulled sort of their EQ view as a team. Because again, back what I talked about earlier, when you have a team that lacks empathy pretty much across the board of every leadership team member and is super high on stress tolerance, which means they can just dole out as much work as possible and they don't even recognize that the people under them are burning out, you've got an issue, and that's your leadership team. So the shadow that they're casting is significant. So that ability to look at things at a relationship level and at a team level and to see some of those reports, I think is an important way of keeping it visible, but again, doing something with it because you see the impact.
Well, this has been really fascinating, and I've enjoyed it immensely. And I think that the sort of my takeaway is that you can use these tools to improve the way you communicate with other people, and you can use EQ to improve the way you interact with others in the world. And I would encourage all the listeners to take a look at the strategy forums and also at ADVISA, and we'll put some links to those groups. And so thank you, Mike, and thank you, Marcy, for sharing your perspectives on these tools and how we can use these tools to positively impact culture. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed that discussion. Mike and Marcy have different perspectives. They're both experts, but different perspectives, different tools in their respective quivers, but a lot to think about. There's a lot of tools out there. You don't have to be married to one over any other, but using maybe a nice combination of tools. And that's sort of what we do. We use PI really as part of the hiring process and with a lot of communication learnings. We use some DISC in the sales team, and I personally use EQ to improve how I come across and interact with others. So I think it's great. Those tools are fun. So what else did we learn?
Yeah, I mean, you said it. There are a ton of tools out there to use. I know we focused on 3, but there's lots more. But, we talked about these tools are one reference point. They're one data point, as Mike likes to say, and that doesn't mean they're not an important one, but you still take them for what they are. They are research-backed and do have validity to them. But take the whole person into account, and we want to make sure that in addition to these, you have a solid recruiting and interview process, because they're not intended to replace this or give you a picture of the whole person. It's just, hey, here's one thing about them to take into consideration. Yeah, one of the things about the tools is they're not always right, but they're never wrong. Yes. I think that's a paraphrase of John. And if you're going to hire somebody who has a PI suited for a detail-oriented job, and the job is not detail-oriented but big picture, or vice versa, it doesn't mean they can't be successful, but it does mean that you need to concentrate on helping them bridge that gap of how they're wired. And so they're only one reference point, but you can't ignore it either, I guess, is what I'm saying. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned we've used this to tailor communication. I mean, I think that especially PI, just because that's what everyone in the building has taken, that is so helpful in understanding each other, understanding, myself and tendencies I have that I maybe need to work on so that I'm a more effective person, but also, how to communicate with someone that maybe I don't fully understand. And there's often a reason, a very rational reason why we're not, as Mike says, speaking the same language. And so it's almost like that translator that you need to get on the same page and make sure you're really talking about the same thing in the same way. because miscommunications happen constantly. Like I feel like that's such, the crux of a lot of problems are that miscommunication. So I think they're crucial in that aspect, just giving us that tool to understand each other better.
Yeah, in as an example, in PI speak, I'm a low B, which means I'm not necessarily very expressive nonverbally, and I interact with John, who's a high B, and he is expressive nonverbally with gesticulation and sort of posture and eye contact and all those kinds of things, facial expressions. And I learned through the PI process that he needs that feedback from me. And so I have to consciously say, okay, well, I need to lean in, I need to nod my head and not just think, oh, that's a great idea in my head, but actually tell him I think that's a great idea through my nonverbal expression. So that's been helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also a low B, and I have the same problem with John, where he's finally told me, like, you're the worst person to communicate to because you just sit there. And where me, it's like my gears are turning, like I'm processing, I'm thinking through what he's saying, and he's just sitting there like going crazy because I'm giving him no feedback, just completely silent.
There's like this PI cartoon where there's a bubble over one person's head is, that's a great idea. I'm thinking about that idea, and I'd like to ponder on that idea. And then the other person's bubble says, he hates my idea. He's just staring at me. Why does he hate the idea?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, one of those things I learned about myself to work on, verbal communication. So, I think we've all benefited from, learning more about ourselves and others through PI, EQ, and DISC. And so, yeah, they've helped us improve as leaders and also just as members of an organization that's working together. And, it seems to be a net positive impact on culture.
Yeah, if leaders, employees can improve through these tools, then it's got to be a net positive on culture.
On our next episode, we will discuss culture shock. What is it and how can we prevent or at least manage it?